Last weekend, the world got its first official indication that the much discussed, much anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive had actually begun, when President Zelensky, at a press conference alongside Canadian PM Trudeau, talked about counteroffensive actions that were taking place. So, how big are the stakes here, and what can we expect from the Ukrainian forces? Can they take back their territories? Joining me now are Anne Applebaum and Oresa Lutsevich. Anne is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and a staff writer for The Atlantic. Oresa is the head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. Anne, you say that the purpose, the real purpose behind this Ukrainian counteroffensive, or the larger purpose, is not purely military. Explain what you mean.
The real purpose of the counteroffensive is to create a political change in Russia, by which I don't mean regime change. There has to be a moment when the Russians decide that the war is not worth fighting anymore, and they take their troops and leave. It's the kind of decision that the French made in 1962 when they decided to pull out of Algeria. You know, the British made that decision a number of times in their empire. There's a moment when the empire ends. And the Ukrainians will use both military tactics as well as political tactics to convince the Russians to leave. And remember, the war is over when the Russians go home. They don't have to, Ukrainians don't have to occupy Moscow. They don't have to get anybody to surrender. All they need to do is get them to leave. And so what you're going to see over the next few weeks is both, you know, the kinds of shaping operations we see now, attempts to cut off railway links and so on. You may see some bigger military moves, but you'll also see more events like this small group of Russians who went over the border, Free Russian Forces calling themselves. You'll see drones in Moscow and other Russian cities. That's also part of persuading the Russians to go home. I think that's a very good way to think about it, because I think the analogy with France and Algeria is exactly right, which is the French tried, and at some point they realized, after by some estimates killing 1 million Algerians, that the Algerians were just not going to, you know, they were going to get their independence. Right. And they just weren't French. Right. You know, I mean, it wasn't going to be part of an empire. And the Ukrainians at some point need to convince the Russians that they're not Russians. They won't ever be. Trying to murder lots of them in order to persuade them to become Russian isn't going to work. You know, it seems like right now it's these shaping operations, as Anne was saying. Do we have a sense as to whether, you know, there are a lot of military analysts who say, look, the thing to do is to put pressure in the southeast so that you start threatening Crimea. Is that what would make the Russians, in your view, you know, feel like, okay, this is getting very dangerous, the stakes are now very high?
Well, Ukrainians remain very resolute to keep fighting. Nobody wants to give up any territory to Russia, including Crimea. So what we see now is society backing this military effort to actually achieve a collapse of the Russian front. I don't think Russians will be very much willing to pack and go. I think they really have to be defeated, and the Russian senior leadership and political elite will have to understand that this is just costing too much. And what we're seeing right now, even what President Zelensky announced as the start of the counteroffensive, the main battlefield battalions that were prepared, over 40,000 men, they have not been deployed yet. They are still in the home front, in the bases, gearing up. Russians are really nervous because Ukrainians have capabilities now that Russians don't.
And when we think about this at a broader level, the Ukrainians have been amazing into their bravery. They've been incredibly good fighters, and they've been, you know, the skill is amazing. But I think all of us do think in the back of our minds, but Russia is so big. It has so many people. Putin could call up another mobilization. You know, the military budget before, obviously, Western aid, which changes the whole thing, but the Russian budget was 10 times the Ukrainian budget. Do the Russians have this capacity to just take the pain and put more troops through the meat grinder and just keep going?
Well, as I said, one of the things the Ukrainians are trying to do is to convince them that that won't happen. But there's also some diplomacy about that. So why is the U.S. giving Ukraine F-16s, which has now been announced? Why did the Germans finally decide to give Ukraine tanks? Of course, there are military reasons for that, but those are also signs to Russia that we aren't going to stop. In other words, you can keep your war going, and we are also going to keep the war going. And so the US and Europe have both been sending signals saying that they too are prepared for a long conflict. So yes, there is a kind of psychological competition going on where the Russians are going to say we'll stay here forever, and the West is saying
so will we.
So will we. And then I think is the that's the thing to watch, is that kind of psychological battle.
You mentioned Crimea particularly. Lots of people outside, from Elon Musk to, at various points, various European statesmen have said, look, Crimea should go back to Russia. Or that the Russian possession of it is appropriate, given that it was originally Russian and Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine in 1954. You're saying Ukrainians will not accept that idea.
Well, first of all, Putin made one of the largest strategic mistakes by annexing more Ukrainian territory in September of last year. He annexed illegally, on paper actually, 4 Ukrainian regions, which equalizes them now to Crimea.
Yeah.
Crimea is not special anymore. It's as much belongs to Ukraine as Zaporizhia or Donetsk. And there was of course, there is concern about escalation over the military campaign in Crimea. But, it has already started. The Black Sea is very much the front line of this war. Remember the downing of the flagship Moskva that is now at the bottom of the Black Sea, the Snake Island, the attack on the bridge. So, in a way, this war in 2014 started with Crimea. And this war must end with Crimea being resolved.
Stay with us. Next on GPS, President Putin on Friday said Russia has started transferring tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, Ukraine's neighbor to the north. He also made yet another threat to use nukes, saying he would do it if there was a threat to Russia's existence. We'll discuss in a moment. And we are back with Anne Applebaum of The Atlantic and Chatham House's Orasia Lutsevich. What do you make of Putin and the nuclear issue?
It's a very serious issue. Because I don't think we have ever faced this kind of a war where a nuclear state, the member of P5, attacked the country, that gave up nuclear weapons, and where other P5 members guaranteed Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty. And to be honest, we have to confess that, of course, we state that nuclear blackmail is not working, but the West, Washington, and other capitals were self-deterring in providing that much needed military assistance to Ukraine. That is why Ukrainians are paying very high price for maintaining that front line, almost like clenching their teeth, waiting for the time when the West will understand that, honestly, Russian troops must be defeated on Ukrainian territory. And this is where Putin has the upper hand with this nuclear saber rattling that he keeps using from day 2, I think, of this war. It's a serious issue.
And you've written this fantastic cover story for The Atlantic on the counteroffensive, but before that, you spent some time with Zelensky. Is it your sense that he is now, he has rallied the world extraordinarily. Is he now directing military operations? Is that being done by Zaluzhny, the general in charge? How should we think about this? Who is going to run this counteroffensive?
So he's said from the beginning that he's not a military commander, and as far as I know, he doesn't try to preempt that role. But there are political considerations to any military offensive. How it should be conducted, what should its purpose be, what role, for example, do those Free Russian forces play? What role does Belarus play? And I think he has a large role in that. So it's because it's both a military and a political project, I think he's got a role.
What was your sense of, his mood, the circle around him, decision making?
They're very self-confident now. It's funny. I saw him right at the beginning of the war. We went in April 2022, right after the Russians had left Kiev, and then we went back essentially a year later. And it was a very transformed experience. He's now surrounded by much more professional people. There isn't this sense of emergency. They seem much more in control of, their economic ideas, their contacts with the world. It's sort of more, it doesn't feel like an emergency everything's about to fall apart at any minute. So he's changed in that way. I mean, I think fundamentally he hasn't changed, though, in that he still has an emotional belief in that the Ukrainians can win, that if he's able to galvanize them and galvanize Ukraine's partners, that they can work together. And he's still very good at linking Ukraine and its trauma to the broader problems of democracy in the world. They've made a big effort to get African and Latin American politicians and journalists to Kiev. They understand their position in the world, and they're still doing the same kind of outreach they've been doing since the beginning of the war.
I was just in Kyiv 2 weeks ago, and it's quite interesting. As I was inside the office of the president meeting his team, it felt very special that, the core of Ukrainian state has been preserved, that it's functional, that it has a vision for Ukraine's role in the Euro-Atlantic architecture of security, vision for the whole world, how we in the future avoid the similar aggression. And also it was right after the Hiroshima summit, and it was the place where really Ukraine plays global. Ukraine is leading on a global conversation, not just a conversation within Europe or just transatlantic community. And I think it's something that this war actually allowed Ukraine to come into the forefront of really global conversation.
You are just back from Ukraine, and you have this terrific report for Chatham House in which you talk about, it seems to me, this very important issue, which is the rebuilding of Ukraine. And you don't mean just the economic rebuilding, but the democratic rebuilding. I mean, Ukraine was famously very corrupt and dysfunctional. Do you think that is, that people are energized about that? Because right now, in effect, Ukraine is under martial law because they have to fight this war. But is there a determination to make sure that it reforms and democratizes fully and all that?
Well, absolutely. I met a lot of representatives from civil society, and we've run a survey for that report where we've asked people, what is the main added value of this recovery other than infrastructure and bridges and roads? And they say it's about modernization of institutions. So Ukrainians themselves are mature enough to understand that if it's well organized, if there's good oversight, and if there's good participation of citizens and communities, this will have this transformative process for Ukraine, that it will allow European integration to move faster, it will allow rule of law to progress, and it will allow Ukraine to build trust. Ukrainians are very hopeful. I will tell you, they clearly, even under all those circumstances, see bright future for the country as part of European Union.
On that hope, thank you both. That was terrific. Next on GPS, the global race for the next big car market, which is electric vehicles. I will talk to Bill Ford, the executive chairman of the Ford Motor Company, about how the U.S. can keep up with the European Union and China.